So in part 2 of my 2-part video on psychotherapy and poor people, I said that if asked, I would make a short video on what I think psychology could do to help the poor. Well, candy twiggy twist, you asked, so here it is. So, how can psychology help the poor? I think it's got to do 3 things. First, it needs to start deprofessionalising. Second, it needs to change what it teaches. And third, it needs to get the heck out of the private sector. So, deprofessionalising psychology. Why is this point number 1? Well, because professionalised psychological support is expensive, but rather than the government spending more money to subsidise those services, it should be rethinking who are the people most appropriate to be delivering those services. And I would argue that those people are mainly those who sit outside of the profession of psychology. And that's why we need to start deprofessionalising, so that those people get recognised and resources can go towards them. And by the way, that's not lowering the quality of those services. In fact, we've got plenty of evidence that psychological support is often enhanced when it's not being delivered by professional psychologists. And a lot of that evidence is in the self-help literature. The work of Julian Rappaport is good to have a look at for that. It's also the message contained in Emery Cowan's famous paper, Help is Where You Find It. So the reason for deprofessionalising is twofold. First, it's because professional psychologists are unaffordable, given the scale of the problem we have. 1 in 8 people in Australia live below the poverty line, and 1 in 4 of those experience high or very high levels of psychological distress. Put simply, we have too many poor people in distress and too few psychologists to treat them. And that problem is never going to be fixed by training more professional psychologists. This is something George Albee talked about in the 1960s and carried on talking about all through his career. And too many psychologists have failed to listen to that message because, well, perhaps because they've got a vested interest in psychologists being in short supply. It helps keep their wages high. But, well, it could be because they're greedy, but it's because... No, it's not because they're greedy, it's because it costs a lot of money to become a psychologist and to stay registered as a psychologist. To become a psychologist, you typically have to go to university and undergo a protracted and expensive period of training, usually around 6 years of full-time study, gain an undergraduate degree, honours degree, and then a master's degree before you can get general registration. And as get general registration with the Psychology Board of Australia. But that has an annual fee, by the way, of just shy of $500 a year. And if you want to get registration as, say, a clinical psychologist, you have to go on a registrar program, and that involves a further 88 weeks of practice. And then once you've made it through all of that, you have to sign up for at least 30 hours of continuing professional development every year to maintain your registration, which you often have to pay for, and that can cost hundreds of dollars every year and could involve you having to join either the APS or the AHPRA and paying them a membership fee. Membership for the annual fee for the APS was $700. So it's expensive. The other reason is that professionalization of psychology has ended up placing too much emphasis on protecting the profession of psychology, whether that be the pay and conditions of psychologists or the protection of who can call themselves a psychologist or who's allowed to offer psychological training or psychological services. It's meant that many people who are effective at providing psychological support are barred from providing that support, and their psychological skills go unrecognised and underused. And this links to that video I made on hairdressers and psychologists a few years ago. A link in the description box. It's part of what George Miller was getting at when he talked about giving psychology away back in 1969 in his presidential address to the American Psychological Association. But again, way too many psychologists either didn't hear or didn't respond to that call. Again, perhaps because of vested interests. Worse, the profession of psychology has since then pretty much doubled down on protectionism. We can see that in that squabble over who should and shouldn't be allowed to claim Medicare rebates for offering psychological services to the poor. Miller's call to give psychology away was once a clarion call for community psychologists, but they too went down the protectionism route, most noticeably in Australia and the US, where they decided that their work needed the recognition, protection, and promotion of psychology's professional bodies, such as the APS and the APA, American Psychological Association. That also happened in the UK, but the protectionism there is not quite so stark. That's reflected in how, in the UK, I can call myself a psychologist, but I can't actually call myself a psychologist here in Australia. I do call myself a critical psychologist, because that's what I am. But the title psychologist is a protected title here. So you can't officially call yourself one unless you obtain and maintain your registration with the Psychology Board of Australia. And I've chosen not to do that, because as a critical psychologist, my role is to critique such bodies, not to conform to them. The quality of empathy and the skill of listening, which sits at the heart of good psychological support, are not things that only psychologists have, and you don't need 6 years of full-time university education to get them. And that needs more recognition, and resources need to be moved over to ensure those people who have no professional training but are still good at this stuff can help us out. And those people are less expensive to employ. And as such, they don't carry that high socioeconomic status around with them that makes them so ineffective when it comes to establishing therapeutic relationships with poor people. And the professionally trained, well-paid psychologists can turn their attention to their fellow high-earning, high-status occupational neighbours, lawyers, political scientists and the like, and go lobby for social reform that would lead to material improvements in the lives of the poor. If you want to reduce the prevalence of poor mental health, reduce inequality and eradicate poverty. It's as simple as that. And that's what our suited and booted psychologists need to be doing. And that leads to the second thing that needs to change so that psychologists can help poor people. We need to change what psychologists are taught when it comes to how they define the problem that they claim to be trying to fix. We need to be teaching psychology students about the socioeconomic determinants of poor mental health. That should be a major part of the curriculum. We need to teach our students that poor mental health is primarily caused by poverty and social inequality. We need to put much more distance between ourselves and the medical or disease model. That model dominates psychology just now, and it blames poor people for their poor mental health by locating their problems with them rather than the conditions in which they're forced to live. We need to divest from teaching on biological causes of poor mental health, research that's been going on since the early 1900s but has yet to provide any robust evidence that such things are a major determinant of mental illness. And we need to be investing more in teaching on the socioeconomic causes of poor mental health. Research has been going on since the mid to late 1800s, such as the seminal work of Seebohm Rountree. And by the way, very early on in that research, it delivered, and it continues to deliver, highly robust evidence that socioeconomic factors are the major determinants of mental illness. So we need to change what we teach, and we need to follow the lead of the BPS Division of Clinical Psychologists in the UK, who in 2013 issued a public statement that said we have to move away from the disease model of mental illness. And if future psychologists have more awareness of that, those causes of mental illness being socioeconomic, they might redefine what the problem is and rethink how they seek to intervene in people's lives. And this feeds into the third thing that I think psychology needs to do to help the poor. We need to pull back from an acceptance that psychologists should work in the private sector. This shouldn't be the sector where psychologists who deliver their clinical hours should be spending most of their time. They should be spending most of their time in the public sector, in the sector that does not have profit as its prime objective, in the sector that is responsible and answerable to the public rather than to private shareholders. It might be argued that psychologists are forced into the private sector because of a lack of public funding of psychological services. Now, that argument is true, but there's also the question as to why does their skill set equip them to move to the private sector so easily? And I would argue this links back to that previous point that psychology has aligned itself too closely to the disease model, which focuses on treating the individual. And that work is easy to monetize in the private sector. It fits into the model of billable hours that now dominates most modes of delivery of clinical health services. It's become the driver of healthcare delivery. This really is what feeds the problems of psychology being so ineffective when it comes to addressing the mental health problems of poor people. They spend their time treating individuals in their private offices rather than dealing with social issues and doing that in public spaces. So those are the three things which combined, deprofessionalizing, retraining, and weaning ourselves off the private sector. Those are the three things that we need to do, I think, if we are going to help poor people with their mental health. Okay. Tell me what you think. What do you think we should do? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I on the wrong path here? I'll be interested in your thoughts. So leave a comment in the comments below on YouTube, the YouTube channel. Okay. So, till next time. Ta-da.